Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Louise.
Here we are again in our closets. I love this time with you.
I know, me too.
All right, so we're on to The Primal Wound by Nancy Verrier. We're going to make her French regardless if she is or not. We
Yes.
enjoy that pronunciation of her name. And today we're discussing chapter 6, which really is we're into the now what happens to the adopted person. We're not
Yeah.
really on a child anymore. This is getting into like what happens, manifestation of your other years. So chapter 6 is the core issues, abandonment and loss. And right away I was like, oh boy, here we go. Just reading that.
I've related so much to so much in this chapter.
Me too. I was like, oh boy, this is going
Yeah.
to touch on all my issues. I just know
Yeah.
it when I start
Yeah.
reading. And so here we go. So right at the beginning, there's two quotes, one about abandonment, one about loss. And I'm just going to read the first quote's short and the second one, just a little bit of it. So one of the most common fears is that of being abandoned. Abandonment is a dominant theme in child myths by Harriet Marketer. But that's interesting because it is a theme in child myths. Whenever like something's scary for a child or in movies, it's always they're left behind. So it's just interesting how that is. Then they get into, loss and bereavement. So there's a long paragraph about bereavement. And then conversely, there's a tendency to suppose that a normal, healthy person can and should get a bereavement, not get over bereavement, not only fairly rapidly, but also completely. So especially in our society, they get into, if you've had any sort of loss, which we'll talk about next, I'll ask you about that. There's our society and many societies, but a lot of Western societies you should just get over this.
Particularly in America, I was going to say, I think it's,
yes,
and probably the UK, just because, the stereotypical button up
yes,
but really, I think this is particularly American.
yeah, it really is. Like, you should always be positive and, oh, you lost somebody or something happened to your marriage or, aren't
here's
you
a
moved
casserole,
on?
move on. Yeah.
Here's a casserole, move on. Like that show, watch the show, Dead Again or Dead to Me. She brings the casserole. Aren't you better yet? Here you go. So what kind of hit you in this at the beginning? I had a lot of things, but I know you did too.
A lot. I mean, as usual, I right on the next page, talking about the profoundness of loss. And this line struck out. There is no permission in our society to recognize in each of life's transitions the polarities between gain and loss or joy and sorrow. We're expected to be happy, sing songs, dance jigs, but never to mourn. And then here, this is kind of, we are a society in which we want everything to be nice or positive, and one in which we try to ignore or get through as soon as possible everything that's painful or difficult. I was going to say, I thought about this when I was reading, and this is probably a Midwestern thing, and maybe it's just a family thing in general, but definitely in my family, like growing up, don't talk about your difficulties. Don't, because in a way, going through anything felt almost like a flaw.
Yes. So I think it's somewhat, I mean, it's funny because we both have Midwestern roots. Like, even though I'm not from the Midwest, I'm from Colorado. My mom was Midwestern German, and it's the stoic, and my husband's mom is Midwestern. It's the stoic. We don't feel our feelings or say, my mom was always really big on publicly having a certain face.
Right.
And I'm that way. So now I'm like that, and I'll be so certain. And Jack's like, oh my God, oh, you care way too much. And I have that. You can't help it. It's like embedded in you, right?
And not even like as simple things as, if you don't feel well, suck it up.
Suck it up. Go on.
I don't
practice.
get sick. You shouldn't get sick, or
right?
that's kind of.
I mean, I was thinking about this. I lost my mom a year and a half ago, and I've I was just telling you before this, I feel like I haven't, there's a certain time when you're allowed to grieve. And then if you keep grieving, people are like, oh my gosh, it's going to bring up her mom again. Or, lately I've been having a lot of things about my father, and he died almost 8 years ago. You were with me for that. And lately it's been like it happened yesterday. But then I even just to my closest friends, I just told you about, but I haven't really told people, oh, I'm going through this with my parents, because you think, oh, I already I beat the dead horse on that, and like, they're not going to want to hear. But the reality is there's no time for loss. And one thing I liked in here is she gets into it's not just death or abandonment, it's all loss in our society. Like, you get married, you lose your singlehood, you get divorced, you're losing the feeling, oh, you should be ready and dating now, you should, everything. You moved, I mean, that's a loss.
Yes, this whole year has been a giant loss, for leaving the state I lived in for 30 years, losing my dog of 14 and a half years,
Oh,
losing my job, losing my home that I loved, a lot of loss. And I definitely stuffed it down. And Becker,
yeah,
like the true empty nest where it's like, okay, we're not
coming
living
home.
together again. He's not coming home.
No.
And I stuffed it all down probably to cope and be able to put one foot in front of the next. But it creeped in. It's been creeping in, and I'll cry at stupid things. And
It does.
I wanted to touch on what you said about your dad and it being 8 years ago, but there's something, I don't know if it's getting older or what it is, but there's something where that does feel like yesterday.
Yeah.
It is. I think when you have that deep connection and the loss, it isn't, time is almost only a concept at that point.
Yeah, time is like, and I feel like the older we're getting, as you know, like, it's flying by. I mean, I feel like you and I were just sitting on that truck, driving around.
Like it, I gotta say.
By the way, so we talked
our discomfort.
Yes, Sarah and I talked about this yesterday, not on camera, not on our YouTube, not on our podcast, but just when we get on and chat forever on our headphones here. We were saying, gosh, do we only do businesses together when we're highly uncomfortable? Because we chose a lot of people know our truck, but there's many listeners out there. Our food truck was a tiny 1977 postal.
No, even earlier, like 1970, I think.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. It was International Harvester. It was a Harvester postal truck. So just picture your old-fashioned mailman from the 70s in his postal truck. That was our truck. We redid it. We'll post a picture of it.
We should. Yes, we will post a picture of it.
A picture when we bought it.
Yes. And then when we put the seat in, where
we put a new seat,
twist around to talk to each other.
We have a seat, and we had this little jumper seat, and we'd sit back there with this cold freezer and this little window where we'd put our heads and come up. And we sat there thinking, we're in our 40s. We can't move. At the end of the day, we're like, oh my God. So now we've decided, let's do a podcast together and sit in tiny closets in our 50s. As we move around and get pillows under us. And oh my gosh.
I know. So if you watch the YouTube and you see us shifting and, maybe see some looks of agony on our face, you now know why. So.
We like to be in pain to bring out our special.
It keeps us honest.
Yes. All right. Back to the chapter.
Back to the chapter.
I thought there was something about depression that crept in that really was interesting to me, because, we think of depression in the society. Here's another thing we do in the society. We drug depression. Mm-hmm. I mean, not that you shouldn't. There's people who should be on depression medication, but we wanted to go away with alcohol, drugs, stuff it down, food, exercise, whatever it is. And this is interesting. I underlined a lot of this. Depression as a result of unresolved grief and anxiety caused by a long forgotten trauma and a concomitant a sense of impending doom, another abandonment, impending doom, another abandonment. I thought that was interesting. Work in tandem and often restrict the full functioning of an adoptee's emotional, intellectual capacities. So it's like trying to walk underwater with resistance, that they said.
Yes.
I thought it was interesting because I did feel I was a pretty happy kid, and I had probably the best circumstance you can have being adopted, but I always felt there was impending doom. I was always I've noticed it as I've gotten older. I've admitted what it is, anxiety ridden, or, nervous, what's happening, but it's that impending, something's going to happen and I have to control it. And they get into the issues of control. If I can control my environment 100%, then nothing will happen, which obviously we know you can't do.
Yes. It's funny how the different manifestations. So there was one thing that I highlighted, except in the case of some truly enlightened adoptive mothers, there is no acknowledgement of the child's loss of the original mother.
Never.
Um,
Never. You know, my mom would say nice things sometimes because she knew it was important and she cared. And I'm sure it really, she lost a baby. I mean, you know, delivered a full baby and lost the baby. So I feel like she did have a sense of what this, you know, what my biological mother, Linda, must have gone through. So sometimes she would say, you know, it was so brave of your mother, you know, really. And I couldn't understand that as a kid. I'm like, brave, you know, because I didn't have a child. I didn't know what she was talking about. But that helps sometimes because I think, okay, she's, you know, but then also she doesn't have any script for anything else. That was all there was. There wasn't, you know, and probably for her to feel what Linda may have felt, that's probably pretty dangerous territory.
right. I would, yes. I mean, as it says, it would take a truly enlightened.
Yeah, like another level.
I don't know that I would have been, you know.
I can probably tell you I wouldn't have been.
Right.
Looking back on my parenting, I'm like, I feel like I was a good parent, but I don't know that I would have been that strong about it.
You know, it's isn't this just the typical life, you know? I would be a great mom now. But you know, we're too old. It's just anyway, it's just the irony.
Me too. I'm like,
your body is ready.
Only knew. Yes.
I know. Your body is ready at, you know, 20, but your maturity level isn't certainly for me, it like
no.
Once I hit 50, I'm like, okay, I feel like a different
Gosh, I'd be such a good mom now.
Yeah.
All those things I did wrong, I wouldn't do. But you know, one day we'll be great grandparents if our children want to have children and all that. Putting that on them.
I know. Don't let them listen to this episode. Yeah, the things that I related to was when one has suffered a loss at the beginning of life before conscious memory, there is a need to work through this loss in order for the person to function well later in life, both personally and professionally. And if we think of unresolved grief as pathological, we should do so only in the sense that it hinders efficiency. The adoptee's emotional reactions to past events are normal and need to be validated.
Mm-hmm.
It took me, you know, here, and again, we say this all the time, but it's still always a process. You know, you're continuing to emotionally grow, spiritually grow, understand yourself, become more and more self-aware. So yeah, it's still just a work in progress.
It's a work in progress. I thought they give a lot of examples of different children, you know, they change their names and she interviews people. And there was a man who said, I put this Michael, that's probably not his real name, but in his teen years, I put my parents through hell and I don't know why. They were good parents. They did their best and always stuck by me, but I was always mad at them, feeling manipulated by them and striking at them. I couldn't seem to help it. It was coming from a dark part of me that I had no control over. Keeps going. Then at the end, he says, the idea that he was reacting to a trauma that he didn't remember had never occurred to him. He just thought he was a bad kid.
Uh-huh.
And that goes back to the statistics we read, I mean, which are probably changing, you know, now in modern times. And of, you know, all these kids are adopted, you know, bad kids. And I actually had a friend who listened to our podcast and said, oh, this kind of makes sense. Your first portion where you talked about the statistics, because I knew so many messed up adopted kids. I'm like, really? God, that's sad. Like, and even I was a good kid. I was still not a good kid. You know what I mean? I was still rebelling in ways, middle school and high school, early high school, where it wasn't really appropriate in my family. Like there was no, my dad would say, why are you so angry? He used to ask me that. I'm like, I don't know. I'm just angry now. And some of that's just being a teenager.
The hormonal changes of.
But I had it in me. I was like, no one gets me.
No one gets me. All my angsty poetry and essays when I was in my early 20s was about no one gets me.
Our next podcast will be us pulling out angsty poetry and reading.
Here's one thing that and I have talked so frequently about this, and it was a big topic in therapy for me for years. Other adoptees talk about an underlying sadness which seems constant and pervasive, a hindrance to real joy.
Mm.
Even when and this was Anna Maria, an adoptee, even when I'm having fun, there's a shadow inside of me, something which keeps me from ever experiencing joy or what I think joy might be.
Oh,
I, I think, until I had Becker, and then I'd have moments of joy. And as silly as this sounds, hiking and yoga bring out joy. But
joy.
really, that felt so on the nose for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if people just met you, they think, oh, she's just joyful and funny, because you're fun. I mean, I met you, I was like, oh, Sarah's a blast, right? But it is you know, I don't know. I had a lot of nicknames from my family, like Gloomy Marie. Marie's my first name, or like Moody Marie, I was always a little bit like that. And people who know me well know that I'm like that kind of now. It takes me a moment to kind of, I can. And as you get older, like you said, yoga and hiking and the outdoors for me, there's things I've learned to do. I've learned to tell people I can't hear that story. Like, I take things way too sensitive. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of adopted kids, I bet they get into that coming up. I'm sure she does, are very sensitive. In my family, it was like, oh, you're so sensitive, like it was this horrible thing. So I always kept everything inside because I was sensitive.
I hid everything, and again, with my family, it was
Oh,
a blended family, too many kids, it was
not
just
safe.
not
Yeah.
safe to,
Yeah.
and it's saying in here in this book, talking about this being PTSD, which,
I thought that was interesting. It's
yeah,
truly a form of PTSD because how
yes.
could it not be? You're taking this child, and I was thinking about in so many scenarios. I mean, there's so many different ways children are without their mothers at birth, through horrible other tragedies. So it's like you're taking a child ripped from that. I do think if say a mother's killed in a car accident and the baby's born, people will be very like, oh my gosh, what that child's been through. Being adopted, no one, it's like, oh, that was good for that baby. Isn't that interesting? Like it's a win-win, which it is
It's
a win-win, but it's a,
my mom and I had a talk recently, um, and when talking about like when she left, and she really wants me to understand that it wasn't a choice, and
hmm,
all that stuff, and I kind of said, but that's a lot, that's logic, and a child doesn't understand that. All that a child knows is that they've been left. It doesn't there's
right.
no there's n- no intellectual response to that as a kid. You take that on yourself, as a
Yep.
child. So,
Like when
um,
parents get divorced, it's their fault. Like the children feel like it's their
yes,
fault, whatever it is. There's no logic for it.
exactly. Um,
Yeah, that's interesting because, it's so hard. I mean, it is hard being a mom, having to tell your kids, I did these things for this reason. It's very hard.
yes. There's
Well,
there's
yeah,
again, it's one of those long, long chapters that, oh, here's something, and I
yeah.
can't believe I'm going to admit this. Because there's so many, talking about the manifestations, and
Yes.
there's PTSD, um, separation and loss in childhood, the numbing effect.
The numbing effect was interesting. Yeah.
If you leave, you're out.
Oh, that's me.
Yeah.
If you leave me, you're out. I'm done.
Yeah. Yep. Done. Done. Done.
I'll even say
Um,
that. Even now, I say it to be horrible.
Fears of abandonment are not fantasies. Um, this is actually what I was just saying about that.
Hmm.
Not it not being an intellectual thing. But here's where I was like, oh my God. Um, Stealing and hoarding. Another behavior which manifests in adopted children is stealing or hoarding. The people from whom the child steals are those he likes or respects the most, his parents, siblings, teachers, or best friends. Some adoptees, reflecting upon this as adults, say that part of this is a feeling that they themselves had been stolen, which is easier to accept than the fact that their mothers gave them away, and that therefore stealing must be all right. It is a legitimate way to get what one feels one needs.
Interesting.
And I remember I had forgotten all about this. After I'd run away and gone to Miami and I was like in summer school and I made friends with this girl and I would steal from her. I would say, "Can I
From
borrow
her.
your," from her. I would say, "Can I borrow your makeup?" And she'd hand me her purse. And then I would like take out a couple of dollars each time. And finally, one day she confronted me about it. And she's like, "Sarah, I love you so much. And I know that things have been hard for you. Can you please tell me why you're stealing from me?" It, this was a
Wow.
suppressed memory until I read this today. And then I never stole from her again. And we talked about it. And
It's probably the best thing ever because she said, I love you. And why are you doing this? I mean, that's it. And you didn't run away from that. You stayed friends.
we stayed friends. Sadly, I can't remember her name. And it was so long ago.
Because we're old.
And it was part of that, like those traumatic years in Florida. That
I can't remember
Florida
how
wasn't
like,
all bad, I gotta say,
no.
because my mom is listening. Like, thank you for taking me in, and it was.
And I heard some fun stories about Florida too.
Yeah, but the beaches are beautiful. But anyway,
You looked adorable in those years. You had the blonde. You were
the perm.
smoking though. You were smoking. Now that you say, okay, you've admitted something. I had something in here, and I can't flip through to find it, but they talked about how you react to loss and death as a child when someone close to you. So my grandparents didn't die till I was in college and everything, but my dog Muffet died. I'll never forget this because I thought there was something wrong with me. And this, it's like you, I did not remember it or think of it until I read the chapter. So my mom was very close to Muffet, who looks very much like my dog Duchess now. And my brother, that was his childhood dog. Mine was later Lucy, because we're 5 years difference. So she was my, childhood dog up till second grade or third grade. And of course I loved her. I mean, my whole life was coming home from school to see Muffet. You know me, I'm an animal freak. Always was, saved everything. And I came home one day and my mom was sobbing at the table. And Muffet was old. She's like where Duchess is now. Like every day they're awesome, but she was old. And my mom was sobbing and sobbing like I've never seen. And I remember staring at her like, what's happening? I still remember what she was wearing, how it felt to walk through the door, looking for my snack after school, the whole feeling. And she said, Muffet died. And I started laughing. I didn't know what to do. So I started laughing.
Yes.
She said, what is wrong with you? And I remember thinking, what is wrong? I couldn't stop laughing. It was like this weird, freaky, not like laughing like callous. It was more like, like this weird laughing. And I went up to my room and I cried and I cried and I cried. And then nobody really would talk to me about Muffet because I was like this mean kid who didn't care. And all I cared about was Muffet. Like, I remember just being devastated, not wanting to like say anything to anybody about her. It almost makes me cry now. But they talked about how kids become numb.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're confronted with death and death of an animal, death of somebody close to them, they laugh or act weird. That was my defense.
Don't express any feelings about it at all.
Don't express feelings. And I'm still the person who doesn't cry when I'm supposed to cry. Like if I go, I lost both my parents in the last few years and I cry all the time, but I don't cry on demand. I'm not a person who sits there and people are crying with me and I start crying. I'm like, it's not, my whole life's been that. And I thought something was really, really wrong with me for many years till I went to therapy. And then that hit me and I'm like, oh my God, that Muffet memory came flooding in. And I remember I must have seen me. My mom was sobbing. We all loved the dog. She knew I lived for coming home and getting in the bed with her. So she's probably like, what the heck's wrong with my kid? Like weird kid, but I was this.
Yes. Isn't it just,
I was a weird kid, but I had that too. Yes.
I know. It's
this is a profound chapter just because when you get into abandonment and loss of any, it's like, it was heavy to read.
I know. The only last, because we can wrap it up, but this was the very last chapter of the last paragraph of the chapter. Although blaming the victim is often a phenomenon of trauma, rape victims and battered women, for instance, being separated from their birth mothers and handed over to strangers in the adoption process is the only trauma where the victims are expected by the whole of society to be grateful. They are not grateful, they are grieving, and the original abandonment and loss are the sources of many other issues for the adoptee.
Yeah, the only place where you're a victim's expected to be grateful.
Yeah.
That's a big,
That
I
is
mean,
so profound.
I'm sure she got so much backlash for writing this when she did. I can just imagine. But
Hopefully
it
we'll be
is,
meeting Nancy one day.
we're trying to get Nancy on the show.
Yes. We haven't
Nancy,
started trying it,
we
but
haven't tried it,
we
but
shall.
when we do plug you and you listen to this, this is what
Yes.
we're
And
and
okay, so on that note, we have a very interesting guest today.